Chapter 9. Next morning the president went out fairly early to pay a call on his cousin before going down to the court. The apparition of Monsieur le Président de Marville, announced by Madame Cibot, was an event in the house. Pons, thus honored for the first time in his life, saw reparation ahead. "At last, my dear cousin," said the president, after the ordinary greetings, "at last I have discovered the cause of your retreat. Your behavior increases, if that were possible, my esteem for you. I have but one word to say in that connection. My servants have all been dismissed. My wife and daughter are in despair. They want to see you to have an explanation. In all this, my cousin, there is one innocent person, and he is an old judge. You will not punish me, will you, for the escapade of a thoughtless child who wished to dine with the Popinots? Especially when I come to beg for peace, admitting that all the wrong has been on our side. An old friendship of 36 years, even supposed that there had been a misunderstanding, has still some claims. Come, sign a treaty of peace by dining with us to-night." Pons involved himself in a diffuse reply, and ended by informing his cousin that he was to sign a marriage contract that evening, how that one of the orchestra was not only going to be married, but also about to fling his flute to the winds to become a banker. "Very well. To-morrow." "Madame la Comtesse Popinot has done me the honor of asking me, cousin. She was so kind as to write." "The day after to-morrow, then." "Monsieur Brunner, a German, my first flute's future partner, returns the compliment paid him to-day by the young couple." "You are such pleasant company that it is not surprising that people dispute for the honor of seeing you. Very well. Next Sunday, within a week, as we say at the courts." "On Sunday we are to dine with Monsieur Graff, the flute's father-in-law." "Very well. On Saturday. Between now and then you will have time to reassure a little girl who has shed tears already over her fault. God asks no more than repentance. You will not be more severe than the Eternal Father with poor little Cecile?" Pons, thus reached on his weak side, again plunged into formulas more than polite, and went as far as the stairhead with the president. An hour later the president's servants arrived in a troop on poor Pons's second floor. They behaved after the manner of their kind. They cringed and fawned, they wept. Madeleine took Monsieur Pons aside and flung herself resolutely at his feet. "It is all my fault, and monsieur knows quite well that I love him." Here she burst into tears. "It was vengeance boiling in my veins. Monsieur ought to throw all the blame of the unhappy affair on that. We are all to lose our pensions. Monsieur, I was mad, and I would not have the rest suffer for my fault. I can see now well enough that fate did not make me for monsieur. I have come to my senses. I aimed too high, but I love you still, monsieur. These 10 years I have thought of nothing but the happiness of making you happy, and looking after things here. What a lot! Oh, if monsieur but knew how much I love him! But monsieur must have seen it through all my mischief-making. If I were to die to-morrow, what would they find? A will in your favor, monsieur. Yes, monsieur, in my trunk under my best things." Madeleine had set a responsive chord vibrating. The passion inspired in another may be unwelcome, but it will always be gratifying to self-love. This was the case with the old bachelor. After generously pardoning Madeleine, he extended his forgiveness to the other servants, promising to use his influence with his cousin the Présidente on their behalf. It was unspeakably pleasant to Pons to find all his old enjoyments restored to him without any loss of self-respect. The world had come to Pons; he had risen in the esteem of his circle. But Schmucke looked so downcast and dubious when he heard the story of the triumph, that Pons felt hurt. When, however, the kind-hearted German saw the sudden change wrought in Pons's face, he ended by rejoicing with his friend, and made a sacrifice of the happiness that he had known during those 4 months that he had had Pons all to himself. Mental suffering has this immense advantage over physical ills: when the cause is removed, it ceases at once. Pons was not like the same man that morning. The old man, depressed and visibly failing, had given place to the serenely contented Pons, who entered the Président's house that October afternoon with the Marquise de Pompadour's fan in his pocket. Schmucke, on the other hand, pondered deeply over this phenomenon, and could not understand it. Your true Stoic never can understand the courtier that dwells in a Frenchman. Pons was a born Frenchman of the Empire, a mixture of 18th-century gallantry and that devotion to womankind so often celebrated in songs of the type of Partant pour la Syrie. So Schmucke was fain to bury his chagrin beneath the flowers of his German philosophy. But a week later he grew so yellow that Mme. Cibot exerted her ingenuity to call in the parish doctor. The leech had fears of icterus, and left Mme. Cibot frightened half out of her wits by the Latin word for an attack of the jaundice. Meantime the two friends went out to dinner together, perhaps for the first time in their lives. For Schmucke it was a return to the fatherland. For Johann Graf of the Hôtel de Reims and his daughter Emilie, Wolfgang Graf the tailor and his wife, Fritz Brunner and Wilhelm Schwab were Germans, and Pons and the notary were the only Frenchmen present at the banquet. The Grafs of the tailor's business owned a splendid house in the Rue de Richelieu, between the Rue Neuve des Petits Champs and the Rue Villedo. They had brought up their niece, for Emilie's father, not without reason, had feared contact with the very mixed society of an inn for his daughter. The good tailor Grafs, who loved Emilie as if she had been their own daughter, were giving up the ground floor of their great house to the young couple, and here the bank of Brunner, Schwab and Company was to be established. The arrangements for the marriage had been made about a month ago. Some time must elapse before Fritz Brunner, author of all this felicity, could settle his deceased father's affairs, and the famous firm of tailors had taken advantage of the delay to redecorate the first floor and to furnish it very handsomely for the bride and bridegroom. The offices of the bank had been fitted into the wing which united a handsome business house with the hotel at the back, between courtyard and garden. On the way from the Rue de Normandie to the Rue de Richelieu, Pons drew from the abstracted Schmucke the details of the story of the modern prodigal son, for whom death had killed the fatted innkeeper. Pons, but newly reconciled with his nearest relatives, was immediately smitten with a desire to make a match between Fritz Brunner and Cécile de Marville. Chance ordained that the notary was none other than Berthier, old Cardot's son-in-law and successor, the sometime second clerk with whom Pons had been wont to dine. "Ah, Monsieur Berthier, you here?" he said, holding out a hand to his host of former days. "We have not had the pleasure of seeing you at dinner lately. How is it?" returned the notary. "My wife has been anxious about you. We saw you at the first performance of The Devil's Betrothed, and our anxiety became curiosity." "Old folk are sensitive," replied the worthy musician. "They make the mistake of being a century behind the times. But how can it be helped? It is quite enough to represent one century; they cannot entirely belong to the century which sees them die." "Ah," said the notary, with a shrewd look, "one cannot run 2 centuries at once." "By the by," continued Pons, drawing the young lawyer into a corner, "why do you not find some one for my cousin Cécile de Marville?" "Ah, why?" answered Berthier. "In this century, when luxury has filtered down to our very porters' lodges, a young fellow hesitates before uniting his lot with the daughter of a president of the Court of Appeal of Paris, if she brings him only 100,000 francs. In the rank of life in which Mademoiselle de Marville's husband would take, the wife was never yet known that did not cost her husband 3,000 francs a year. The interest on 100,000 francs would scarcely find her in pin money. A bachelor with an income of 50 or 20,000 francs can live on an entresol. He is not expected to cut any figure. He need not keep more than one servant, and all his surplus income he can spend on his amusements. He puts himself in the hands of a good tailor, and need not trouble any further about keeping up appearances. Far-sighted mothers make much of him. He is one of the kings of fashion in Paris. But a wife changes everything. A wife means a properly furnished house," continued the lawyer. "She wants the carriage for herself. If she goes to the play, she wants a box, while the bachelor has only a stall to pay for. In short, a wife represents the whole of the income which the bachelor used to spend on himself. Suppose that husband and wife have 30,000 francs a year between them. Practically, the sometime bachelor is a poor devil who thinks twice before he drives out to Chantilly. Bring children on the scene, he is pinched for money at once. Now, as Monsieur and Madame de Marville are scarcely turned 50, Cecile's expectations are bills that will not fall due for 15 or 20 years to come, and no young fellow cares to keep them so long in his portfolio. The young featherheads who are dancing the polka with lorettes at the Jardin Mabille are so cankered with self-interest that they don't stand in need of us to explain both sides of the problem to them. Between ourselves, I may say that Mademoiselle de Marville scarcely sets hearts throbbing so fast, but that their owners can perfectly keep their heads, and they are full of these anti-matrimonial reflections. If any eligible young man, in full possession of his senses and an income of 20,000 francs, happens to be sketching out a programme of marriage that will satisfy his ambitions, Mademoiselle de Marville does not altogether answer the description. "And why not?" asked the bewildered musician. "Oh," said the notary, "well, a young man nowadays may be as ugly as you and I, my dear Pons, but he is almost sure to have the impertinence to want 600,000 francs, a girl of good family, with wit and good looks and good breeding, flawless perfection, in short." "Then it will not be easy to marry her." "She will not be married so long as Monsieur and Madame de Marville cannot make up their minds to settle Marville on her when she marries. If they had chosen, she might have been the Vicomtesse Popinot by now. But here comes Monsieur Brunner. We are about to read the deed of partnership and the marriage contract." Greetings and introductions over, the relations made Pons promise to sign the contract. He listened to the reading of the documents, and towards 5:30 the party went into the dining-room. The dinner was magnificent, as a city merchant's dinner can be when he allows himself a respite from money-making. Graff of the Hôtel du Rhin was acquainted with the first provision dealers in Paris. Never had Pons nor Schmucke fared so sumptuously. The dishes were a rapture to think of. Italian paste, delicate of flavour, unknown to the public, smelts fried as never smelts were fried before, fish from Lake Léman with a real Genevese sauce, and a cream for plum pudding which would have astonished the London doctor who is said to have invented it. It was nearly 10 o'clock before they rose from table. The amount of wine, German and French, consumed at that dinner would amaze the contemporary dandy. Nobody knows the amount of liquor that a German can imbibe and yet keep calm and quiet. To even have an idea of the quantity, you must dine in Germany and watch bottle succeed to bottle, like wave rippling after wave along the sunny shores of the Mediterranean, and disappear as if the Teuton possessed the absorbing power of sponges or sea sand. Perfect harmony prevails meanwhile. There is none of the racket that there would be over the liquor in France. The talk is as sober as a money-lender's extempore speech. Countenances flush like the faces of the brides in frescoes by Cornelius or Schnorr, imperceptibly, that is to say, and reminiscences are poured out slowly while the smoke puffs from the pipes. About 10:30 that evening, Pons and Schmucke found themselves sitting on a bench out in the garden, with the ex-flute between them. They were explaining their characters, opinions, and misfortunes with no very clear idea as to why or how they had come to this point. In the thick of a potpourri of confidences, Wilhelm spoke of his strong desire to see Fritz married, expressing himself with vehement and vinous eloquence. "What do you say to this programme for your friend Brunner?" cried Pons in confidential tones. "A charming and sensible young lady of 24, belonging to a family of the highest distinction. The father holds a very high position as a judge. There will be 100,000 francs paid down and 1,000,000 to come." "Wait," answered Schwab. "I will speak to Fritz this instant." The pair watched Brunner and his friend as they walked round and round the garden. Again and again they passed the bench. Sometimes one spoke, sometimes the other. Pons was not exactly intoxicated. His head was a little heavy, but his thoughts, on the contrary, seemed all the lighter. He watched Fritz Brunner's face through the rainbow mist of fumes of wine, and tried to read auguries favorable to his family. Before very long, Schwab introduced his friend and partner to M. Pons. Fritz Brunner expressed his thanks for the trouble which Pons had been so good as to take. In the conversation which followed, the two old bachelors, Schmucke and Pons, extolled the estate of matrimony, going so far as to say, without any malicious intent, that marriage was the end of man. Tea and ices, punches and cakes were served in the future home of the betrothed couple. The wine had begun to tell upon the honest merchants, and the general hilarity reached its height when it was announced that Schwab's partner thought of following his example. At 2 o'clock that morning, Schmucke and Pons walked home along the boulevards, philosophizing à perte de raison as they went on the harmony pervading the arrangements of this our world below. On the morrow of the banquet, Cousin Pons betook himself to his fair cousin the Présidente, overjoyed, poor dear noble soul, to return good for evil. Surely he had attained to a sublime height, as everyone will allow, for we live in an age when the Montyon prize is given to those who do their duty by carrying out the precepts of the gospel. "Ah," said Pons to himself as he turned the corner of the Rue de Choiseul, "they will lie under immense obligations to their parasite." Any man less absorbed in his contentment, any man of the world, any distrustful nature, would have watched the president's wife and daughter very narrowly on this first return to the house. But the poor musician was a child. He had all the simplicity of an artist, believing in goodness as he believed in beauty. So he was delighted when Cecile and her mother made much of him. After all the vaudevilles, tragedies, and comedies which had been played under the worthy man's eyes for 12 long years, he could not detect the insincerity and grimaces of social comedy, no doubt because he had seen too much of it. Anyone who goes into society in Paris and knows the type of woman, dried up, body and soul, by a burning thirst for social position and a fierce desire to be thought virtuous, anyone familiar with the sham piety and the domineering character of a woman whose word is law in her own house, may imagine the lurking hatred she bore this husband's cousin whom she had wronged. All the demonstrative friendliness of mother and daughter was lined with a formidable longing for revenge, evidently postponed. For the first time in Amélie de Marville's life, she had been put in the wrong, and that in the sight of the husband over whom she tyrannized, and not only so, she was obliged to be amiable to the author of her defeat. You can scarcely find a match for this position, save in the hypocritical dramas which are sometimes kept up for years in the Sacred College of Cardinals, or in chapters of certain religious orders. At 3 o'clock, when the president came back from the law courts, Pons had scarcely made an end of the marvelous history of his acquaintance, Monsieur Frédéric Brunner. Cecile had gone straight to the point. She wanted to know how Frederic Brunner was dressed, how he looked, his height and figure, the color of his hair and eyes. And when she had conjectured a distinguished air for Frederic, she admired his generosity of character. "Think of his giving 500,000 francs to his companion in misfortune! Oh, mamma, I shall have a carriage and a box at the Italien." Cecile grew almost pretty as she thought that all her mother's ambitions for her were about to be realized, that the hopes which had almost left her were to come to something after all. As for the Présidente, all that she said was, "My dear little girl, you may perhaps be married within the fortnight." All mothers with daughters of 23 address them as "little girl." "Still," added the President, "in any case we must have time to make inquiries. Never will I give my daughter to just anybody." "As to inquiries," said Pons, "Berthier is drawing up the deeds. As to the young man himself, my dear cousin, you remember what you told me? Well, he is quite 40 years old. He is bald. He wishes to find in family life a haven after a storm. I did not dissuade him. Every man has his tastes." "One reason the more for a personal interview," returned the President. "I am not going to give my daughter to a valetudinarian." "Very good, cousin. You shall see my suitor in 5 days, if you like, for, with your views, a single interview would be enough." Cecile and her mother signified their rapture. "Frederic is decidedly a distinguished amateur. He begged me to allow him to see my little collection at his leisure. You have never seen my pictures and curiosities. Come and see them," he continued, looking at his relatives. "You can come simply as 2 ladies, brought by my friend Schmucke, and make Monsieur Brunner's acquaintance without betraying yourselves. Frederic need not in the least know who you are." "Admirable!" cried the President. The attention they paid to the once scorned parasite may be left to the imagination. Poor Pons that day became the Président's cousin. The happy mother drowned her dislike in floods of joy. Her looks, her smiles, her words sent the old man into ecstasies over the good that he had done, over the future that he saw by glimpses. Was he not sure to find dinners such as yesterday's banquet over the signing of the contract, multiplied indefinitely by 3 in the houses of Brunner, Schwab, and Graf? He saw before him a land of plenty, a vie de cocagne, a miraculous succession of plats couverts, of delicate surprise dishes, of exquisite wines. "If Cousin Pons brings this through," said the President, addressing his wife after Pons had departed, "we ought to settle an income upon him equal to his salary at the theatre." "Certainly," said the lady. And Cecile was informed that if the proposed suitor found favor in her eyes, she must undertake to induce the old musician to accept a munificence in such bad taste. Next day the President went to Berthier. He was anxious to make sure of Monsieur Frederic Brunner's financial position. Berthier, forewarned by Madame de Marville, had asked his new client Schwab to come. Schwab, the banker, was dazzled by the prospect of such a match for his friend. Everybody knows how deeply a German venerates social distinctions, so much so that in Germany a wife takes her husband's official title and is the Frau General, the Frau Rat, and so forth. Schwab, therefore, was as accommodating as a collector who imagines that he is cheating a dealer. "In the first place," said Cecile's father, "as I shall make over my estate of Marville to my daughter, I should wish the contract to be drawn up on the dotal system. In that case, Monsieur Brunner would invest 1,000,000 francs in land to increase the estate, and by settling the land on his wife, he would secure her and his children from any share in the liabilities of the bank." Berthier stroked his chin. "He is coming on well, is Monsieur le Président," thought he. When the dotal system had been explained to Schwab, he seemed much inclined that way for his friend. He had heard Fritz say that he wished to find some way of insuring himself against another lapse into poverty. "There is a farm and pasture land worth 1,200,000 francs in the market at this moment," remarked the president. "If we take up shares in the Bank of France to the amount of 1,000,000 francs, that will be quite enough to guarantee our account," said Schwab. "Fritz does not want to invest more than 2,000,000 francs in business. He will do as you wish, I am sure, Monsieur le Président." The president's wife and daughter were almost wild with joy when he brought home this news. Never, surely, did so rich a capture swim so complacently into the nets of matrimony. "You will be Madame Brunner de Marville," said the parent, addressing his child. "I will obtain permission for your husband to add the name to his, and afterwards he can take out letters of naturalization. If I should be a peer of France some day, he will succeed me." The 5 days were spent by Madame de Marville in preparations. On the great day she dressed Cecile herself, taking as much pains as the admiral of the British fleet takes over the dressing of the pleasure yacht for Her Majesty of England when she takes a trip to Germany. Pons and Schmucke, on their side, cleaned, swept, and dusted Pons's museum rooms and furniture with the agility of sailors cleaning down a man of war. There was not a speck of dust on the carved wood, not an inch of brass but it glistened. The glasses over the pastels obscured nothing of the work of Latour, Cruz, and Lyotard, illustrious painter of the Chocolate Girl. Miracles of an art, alas, so fugitive! The inimitable lustre of Florentine bronze took all the varying hues of the light. The painted glass glowed with color. Every line shone out brilliantly. Every object threw in its phrase in a harmony of masterpieces arranged by two musicians, both of whom alike had attained to be poets.